Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Ruprecht with the Child Care State Capacity Building Center, and welcome to the webinar on making websites accessible to all families. This webinar is part of the Hot Topics and Consumer Education website series and is designed to bring you new information and resources in order to help you enhance your consumer education website. The series runs through December, and we just started last month in April, and some of you were on the line for that. And you will have plenty of opportunity to participate in a variety of webinars. This webinar series will showcase topics such as the one today that are a mix of best practices and required elements of the consumer education website. Our goal is to give you ways in which you can enhance how families, child care providers, and other stakeholders experience your website. Future website topics, or rather future webinar topics, will highlight how you can use resources from our National Center partners to enhance your website and how to use data analytics. We also have webinars planned to address ways to enhance your website using feedback from stakeholders, data governance, and other webinars to help you think about branding and social media strategies. So make sure you check out the webinar announcement so you can alert the right staff to be on these calls. And I have put in the chat box a link to the website where you can download the webinar announcement and sign up for them. Some of these webinars that we will present are a little bit more technical in nature, so you will probably want to have your IT people or your communication staff or other stakeholders listen in so that you can take full advantage of the information and resources we'll share in each of these webinars. Throughout the webinar today, we'd like you to use that chat feature to type in questions you might have on this topic. We will remind you throughout the webinar to do so, and we'll take the questions and sort through them, and in 2 weeks, on May 23rd from 2 to 2:30, we'll answer as many questions as we can in our Ask Me Anything webinar. If you think of a question from the webinar, don't worry. Throughout this webinar today, we will post in the chat box an email that you can send in questions should you have some questions after the webinar. And we will also send a follow-up email so you have that information as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our presenters today. As I said, I'm Karen Ruprecht with the Child Care State Capacity Building Center, and I'm the Managing Director of Early Childhood Systems, and I work a lot with the consumer education work. Donna?
Good afternoon. I'm Donna Patrick. I've been a web accessibility specialist at ICF for the past 18 years. I've mostly been involved with federal government websites, but I've lately been working on a few commercial website projects. Yael?
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Yael. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Moment of anxiety there for a moment. My name is Yael Moroz. I am a senior business analyst with ICF. I work mainly on requirements for IT development projects, and 508 is a passion of mine, and accessibility and working accessibility requirements is something that I try to integrate into my work every day. Josh?
Hi, this is Josh Long. I'm digital strategist at ICF. I've been working on digital government products for the last decade or so, all the way up to large.gov sites, down to local and state government sites, focusing on kind of the voice of the user and making sure that IT products, including consumer education websites, are user-focused and accessible.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We're so thrilled to have you on with us today and presenting this information. And now we want to get an idea of who's on the phone and who's on the computer with us today. So we'd like you to take a quick poll and choose just one, what role that best describes what you do professionally. So if you could select your role, and we'll give you a minute or so to do so. like we have a good number of state government professionals on the phone with us. Well as some other state-level professionals and training and technical assistance professionals. And we have some people on the phone with us that contract with the state and develop the website through through contracts. Welcome, Lynn from Delaware. So great. So it looks like we have a good number of people on the phone that identify themselves as state government professionals. So thank you for taking the time to do that. As you all know, it's important to know who's in the room or who's on the computer and phone with you as you're presenting these things. So we appreciate you taking the time and filling out that quick survey for us. So I'm going to kind of start it off and just kind of cover what we're going to go over today, so you have an idea of what's coming from our guest speakers and what we're going to be covering. So we'll talk a little bit about accessibility requirements and some of the legislation that governs accessibility. We'll talk about barriers to accessibility and guidelines and best practices for accessible web design. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about audits and assistive technologies and the process of remediation. And then we'll end our webinar with Josh talking about approaches to translating content into languages other than English. So let's go ahead and get started talking about some of the accessibility legislation and requirements. And we'll start, first of all, talking about the Child Care and Development Fund final rule requirements. As you know, there are requirements in legislation around ensuring accessibility of the consumer education website. And we'll start with the CCDF final rule requirements, which many of you, since you identify yourselves as state-level professionals, are probably quite familiar with this final rule. So in the final rule, it states that states and territories are to ensure that the website is accessible to all families, and it must provide for the widest possible access to services for families who speak languages other than English and persons with disabilities, and it must meet all federal and state laws regarding accessibility, including the ADA Act. And I won't go through and read the rest, but I do want to turn it over to Yael because she's going to talk about some other requirements of legislation that governs accessibility for things such as consumer education websites. So Yael?
Thanks, Karen. So let's spend a moment talking about Section 508 requirements, which, as you know, state government professionals and other non-government and training and technical assistance professionals, I am certain that this is not something you're seeing for the first time, but the Rehabilitation Act of '73 states that when developing, when developing using electronic and information technology, each federal agency shall ensure that individuals with disabilities have the same access and use of information that is comparable to people who are not individuals with disabilities. So so this is kind of general, and so how do we implement that, which is really the big question. So a little bit about the milestones of Section 508. Section 508 was originally added as an amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of '73 in 1986. It was then amended by Congress and enacted in 1998 to require federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities. It was published in the Federal Register in December 2000, and as of January 2018, the technical requirements of Section 508, as they were defined initially, were changed to incorporate the WCAG 2.0 up to level AA. And I'll spend a few moments in a little bit to cover what that actually means. But before we do that, I would like to talk a little bit about barriers to accessibility. What is it about disabilities and other abilities that make us need to implement accessibility into our websites? So most often, the disabilities that we're talking about are visual, hearing, and motor disabilities. In terms of visual, that covers users who have blindness or low vision or color blindness. And users with visual disabilities typically navigate online applications using keyboard strokes, and they also use screen readers to read the content out loud to them. Users with low vision usually need a way to enlarge the font in order to read or adapt the content so that it's more legible. And users with color blindness may have trouble distinguishing colors, most commonly reds and greens, but there are other variations. Users with auditory hearing impairments may be deaf or hard of hearing, and they rely on transcripts or embedded audio embedded audio replacements to access auditory information. Motor disabilities can also affect computer use. Some users have a difficulty using a mouse and rely on keyboard strokes for navigation, and some with various other motor impairments use other assistive technologies such as mouse sticks and eye tracking devices. And but these alternative methods usually emulate a keyboard. So if you make your website accessible to users who may only use a keyboard, it's pretty, you make it accessible to other assistive devices as well. But there are also a good number of neurological and cognitive and learning differences, such as users with intellectual disabilities, users with attention deficit disorders who are distractible or unable to focus on large amounts of information, or have difficulties with short-term memory retrieval, users with epilepsy, that flashing elements on the page can trigger an epileptic seizure. And there are also less frequently mentioned barriers to accessibility. I don't know that they are considered bona fide disabilities, but more cultural conditions such as age, folks who are young or folks who are old, folks who are newcomers to technology, people with low literacy rates, people whose first language is not the language of the website, and many more other conditions. I will just mention one which I find quite interesting. People with anxiety disorders are also come under this umbrella because they need clear direction on the website, and they need clear validation and know where they are in the hierarchy and in the navigation, and they need to have clear language that is not alarming. So we can see that the definition of disabilities and other abilities that we need to take under consideration for accessibility is ever growing and very vast. So given all these considerations, it's very easy to get overwhelmed with what am I supposed to do to get my website more accessible given so many considerations. How do we ensure that our websites are accessible to all users? So happily, there are guidelines and standards and techniques for web accessibility. And today I want to present two of these resources. One is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, commonly referred to as WCAG, which are technical guidelines that are most often referenced to ensure website accessibility. Today, WCAG 2.0 is considered the minimum standard for ADA website compliance. And the other resource that I want to present is a list of the top 10 best practices, subjectively speaking. Basically, it's kind of a cheat sheet, a most bang for the buck pointers to help you in the way to optimal accessibility of your website. I would like to skip ahead and come back to this slide. Level of conformance. So, oops. Okay, before we skip ahead. The WCAG 2.0 guidelines include 38 guidelines, which are organized by 4 principles and classified by 3 levels of conformance. So the 4 guiding principles are that features need to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And the 3 levels of conformance are A, AA, and AAA. So in terms of the principles, which are also commonly known as POUR, because that's the anagrams. So perceivable means that users should be able to become aware of the information through their senses, mainly through seeing and hearing. An example for that is when a user hovers over an image on the website, then alternative text would enable the screen reading software to read out loud a short description of the image. Operable means that users should be able to interface and interact throughout the website. And an example is that, for example, a user who cannot use the mouse to access all functionality should be able to use keyboard jump keys such as the tab key, the space bar, the arrow keys. Understandable means that users should be able to understand and work within the website provided. An example is to use plain English and avoid highly technical language, or maybe use bullets and lists instead of lengthy text. And finally, robust means users should be able to use accessible content as the technology changes. So, for example, using unique IDs for markup attributes, using well-formed code, and properly nested attributes means that even as the technology changes, your code can still operate and provide accessibility to the vast majority, if not all, users. And as I mentioned, there are 3 levels of compliance. The lowest is A, double A is the mid-range, and highest is triple A. And so, for example, for time-based media, meaning video, level A would mean that you have to fulfill the level A guideline, you should provide an audio description track or text that transcribes a video clip that you have on your website. AA is even more demanding, and it pertains to live multimedia content such as audio broadcasts, video conferences, and to fulfill this requirement, you should provide real-time captions to your live event. And the highest level of adhering to this guideline would mean that all media containing audio, whether it's a canned clip or real-time conference, should be accompanied by sign language video to make the material on your page accessible. So with a little bit of WCAG 2.0 information, I would like to switch gears now to go through the 10 best practices for accessible web design. And these are best practices, as I mentioned, these are my 10 best practices. Definitely there are others. I try to collect the best practices into convenient buckets, and if you follow these guidelines, you are assured a decent level, I'm not going to say complete level, but a decent level of accessibility in your website. So first of all, images. And this is an example from the Matter page. And it's a nice example of proper use of images. So the absolute #1 guideline for accessibility is to provide alternative text using alt tags to images on your page. And it's amazing still, with so much emphasis on accessibility, how often we see, not in this case, but how often we see images without alt tags at all or without proper alt tags. So in this case, an alt tag was added to the image specifying child raising hand up in class. This is a good example of providing alternative text because the text is both a meaningful description of the image and is readable by a screen reader. Another good practice when talking about images is don't embed text in images, or don't use an image that looks like text, because screen readers have no way of reading that. In the Michigan example, the links to find childcare and find a resource center at the bottom left of the screen cap, these are not images. These are text links, and they're well defined by shape and color. And what I also like to emphasize is use images judiciously. Sure, the web is a visual medium, but people with vision disabilities have a hard time accessing that information. So use images to illustrate and summarize your text. Don't convey content with images alone, and size your images for optimal download. And really don't use too many, because even for a sighted user, too many visuals on the page are a distraction. Next one up is content. And there are several very commonsensical things to do with to ensure that the content is accessible. One is make it easy to follow. This homepage uses short text in plain language. It provides a visual illustration, and it allows users to seek more information. Use hierarchical structures. Make sure headers are nested. Make sure that H1s are followed by H2 and H3 rather than, these are header levels, rather than jumping from, within different levels of headings. It never hurts to think like a screen reader, meaning ensure that all content on the page is accessible using the keyboard. Distinguish between foreground and background color. Use, in this example, black over white, always a very safe, albeit somewhat boring contrast, but also white over orange. Very effective, very good contrast ratio in using forward and background color. And another item is provide the ability to resize text. This is a capability that all web browsers have innately, inherently, but if you're using other devices, it may, such as mobile devices, it's not always easy to resize text. The language you use should be plain in order to be accessible to most users, young users, older users, users whose main first language is not English. Write for your audience in a way that they can understand and find the information they need. And also, less is more. Provide users with just enough text to get the most important points across. Don't spill out everything you know about the topic, but shorten your text to make sure it contains really the relevant points. Use short paragraphs. Use bullets and lists to convey the main ideas. Break the text into sections with descriptive headings. Use white space to break things up, and really work to eliminate unnecessary text. Links. This is an example from My Child Delaware, the families page, and it's a nice example of proper use of links. The links here, it's kind of hard to see, but they include meaningful text. They use concrete text for links, and they avoid generic links such as click here or learn more. They use action words like find out about this and that, or learn where to get help. The links use color very nicely. We should aspire to make links clearly visible by using high contrast of color between the link text and the background. And it can make links stand out by using a combination of features. Noticeably different color together with an underline or bold or larger font size. When it comes to tables, there's really only one do and one don't. Do use tables to display data. Make sure that the code distinguishes between the table headers and the table and the data cells. because screen readers read left to right, top to bottom. So in this case, a screen reader would read the top as the header row, and then everything below it as the data. And do not use tables for formatting the page or create spacing. This was very common use in the past when divs and other elements on the page were not as well detailed. And it was basically a misuse of tables, and it was used to create, for example, multiple columns of text on the page, or to create a kind of a navigational sidebar with the main pane for the text. This is now a really big no-no. One more thing I wanted to add about captioning tables. As sighted users, we are used to seeing a caption below the table, but for people who use screen readers, to read something like Table 3, child care centers, for a user who uses a screen reader, by the time they get to that caption, they've already gone through the table. So it's kind of out of sync for them. So a good practice is to provide a caption inside the table tags in your code. That way the screen reader reads it first and then provides the user more context about the use of this table. Multimedia, and I think I need to shorten my speech a little bit because of time considerations. Multimedia, the example on the screen is a really nice example of providing alternatives to visual information because it provides both closed captioning in real time in the right-hand portion of the screen capture, but also an audio-described transcript. Sorry. Other issues with multimedia is to avoid autoplay, which means files starting to audio files that start to play seemingly on their own without the user manipulating them. And provide users with the capabilities to control the playing media with play or pause or stop controls that the user can initiate the action for use. When it comes to forms, some key guidelines are provide simple forms with clear instructions to promote the user's spatial orientation. Ensure each field is clearly labeled so that the user knows which label goes with which input window, and ensure that the forms are keyboard accessible. In terms of downloads, I apologize for the slide because it doesn't seem to illustrate the point. But the point is, when you provide file downloads, make sure that the files you're providing are accessible. Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, and PDFs can all be made accessible and readable to screen readers. And some of them have their own accessibility checks built into the Microsoft Word application or the PowerPoint, and definitely mitigate accessibility violations before providing these files as downloads. Navigation, no big surprises here. Users who can't use the mouse navigate using the tab key and other keyboard keys. So design your website so it can be navigable in an intuitive and sequential way. And of course, many of the other best practices we already discussed relate to navigation as well. Provide meaningful link text, avoid generic sort of click here types of links, help users understand where they are in the website by providing maybe a different color or a bigger format on the website tab that they are on at the moment. And the last best practice, and I'm really going to touch on that briefly, is ARIA markup, which is, ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it's a set of attributes that is kind of an elaboration of HTML, and it allows users to define landmark roles on the page, such as banner, main, navigation, search, etc. And these landmarks identify significant sections on the web page and make them more keyboard and screen reader. And now I'm turning this over to Donna Patrick, our accessibility guru, to talk about audits and assistive technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Yael. That was very informative. Now that you know about accessibility legislation and best practices, let's talk a little bit about web accessibility audits and assistive technologies. Web accessibility audits must be done by somebody who knows enough about web accessibility that they can interpret the web content guidelines as it applies to your web content and design. Here are some simple things you can do to manually test your website. And thank you for moving the slide ahead. I forgot to do that. Okay, so use only your keyboard to navigate your website. Can you do this? Can you put your mouse in a drawer? And can you use your tab key to navigate all the actionable elements, the links and the buttons? Can you, do you know where you are? Is there some sort of focused, highlighted, is the focused content highlighted? Is there a rectangle around it? Do you know where you are every time you tab? Does the tabbing follow a logical order? Does it match the visual order? When you press enter, does it trigger the interactive element? Does it open a link? Does it expand an accordion? Does it submit a form button? If your website contains videos, check to make sure they've got captions and that the captions match the audio. Does any content blink or scroll? It shouldn't. Look at the content on the tab or the title bar of the browser. That's the page title. Does it briefly describe the content of the page? What about your links? Is the link text descriptive, or is it just the URL of the website, of the destination? It should be descriptive. Is color used to convey information? For instance, in charts and graphs, or are links embedded in paragraphs and don't have an underline? You need to really make sure that color is not used to convey information. There are many products available that can help you find some accessibility issues automatically with just a click of a button. Some of these are downloadable programs, and most of them are extensions to browsers. Some cost money, and some don't cost money. Most of the ones that I use do not cost money. Examples of what can be tested for automatically are missing alt text on images, color contrast issues, missing labels or forms, or heading structure. And those can be, you can just click a button and find out whether or not those are issues. As I said, most of the programs I use for accessibility testing are free, but some cost money, some cost a lot of money. Use your favorite search engine to search for accessibility software and or plugins for your browsers. Another way to test your website for accessibility is to use assistive technology. What is assistive technology? Yael discussed ways people with disabilities can access information on websites. All those examples are examples of assistive technology. Assistive technology are products, equipment, and systems that enhance learning, working, and daily living for persons with disability. For instance, eyeglasses. Do you wear eyeglasses to see better? Then you're using assistive technology. Do you know anybody who uses hearing aids? Those are another example of assistive technology. Here are a few examples of other kind of assistive technology that you may not know about, or actually Yael did talk about a lot of these. Note that we are not endorsing any of these products that are on this page. They're just here for illustrative purposes. Screen readers, though that's software that's primarily used by the blind or visually impaired people to read the content of computer screens. Screen magnification software that allows users to control the size of text and graphics on the screen. Unlike using a zoom in your browser, these applications allow the user to have the ability to see the enlarged text in relation to the rest of the screen. Text readers. This is software that might be used by people with various forms of cognitive disabilities that affect their ability to read text. This software will read the text with a synthesized voice and may have a highlighter to emphasize the word being spoken. Newer versions of Microsoft products, including Outlook, have this feature. Note that these don't read things like menus or types of elements. They only read the text. Speech input software provides people with difficulty in typing an alternate way to type text and also control the computer. Users can give the system some limited commands to perform mouse actions. Alternate input devices are things like head pointers, which is a stick that might be they might wear on their forehead to use their keyboard, or motion tracking or eye tracking devices, single switch entry devices. These kinds of devices can be used with other alternative input or by themselves. They're typically used with on-screen keyboards. The on-screen keyboard has a cursor move across the keys, and when the key the user wants is in focus, the user will click the switch. In case you weren't aware, there is a federal resource that states can share with consumers if they need assistive technologies. You can go to this website and search for your specific state resources. Remediation. So remediation is the fixing of issues after a website or a document has been created and evaluated. An auditor will often provide suggestions on how to fix an issue, but the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines also provides guidance for each success criterion. It's got a how to meet WCAG 2.0. It's very helpful. The best way to avoid costly and time-consuming remediation is by shifting left, which means addressing accessibility at the beginning of a project instead of after it has been completed. You can incorporate accessibility in the requirements phase by writing user stories that include people with disabilities. You can incorporate accessibility in the design phase by making suggestions for example, for color, for layout, for images, spacing, etc. Finally, in the development stage, work with the developers to ensure they understand how to implement accessibility features, for for existence ARIA. Other resources. So there are a lot of resources we've talked about. Here's a list of some resources. My one top to-go resource is the WebAIM or webaim.org, where you can find tutorials, checklists, and even a mailing list centered around web accessibility, which is frequented by some of the leading accessibility experts from around the world. If you want to get to the meat of the standards, go right to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is kind of hard to get used to, but it's a great resource. So now I'll turn the stage over to Josh, who will talk about translating web content.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Donna. So I'm going to talk really quickly about translating web content for the consumer education websites. Translation is certainly content related, so it seems in some cases like a separate topic, but I think it's really important to think about translation too in terms of accessibility, because there are definitely, for a lot of sites, going to be people who speak languages other than English accessing that site. And so this is really about how we not only kind of improve the user experience by making content available to those folks in different languages, but also how we improve accessibility by enabling a wider audience that we're supposed to be serving to access the information on the website. So one of the ways up front that you can address how you're going to format content and structure your content in a way that can be translated and to kind of set some governance policies around translation of content for your consumer education website is to make sure that that's documented in a way that's consistently followed within a style guide. Now, of course, there are different types of style guides out there. There are some that might just give you design guidelines, so those would be things like font and spacing, perhaps even visual design aspects like branding and color. There are some that might define some grammar and style rules as well, or some that might get more specific about different multilingual guidelines. So an example there would be which kind of number styles you're going to use based on the target audience that you're trying to serve and how that gets translated. So I think for time's sake, we're going to skip poll 2. So I'll talk a little bit about how do you choose which languages you want to translate for your website's needs. So again, once you've decided on some of this, you can document that in the style guide for your website. And so along with all of those things that you would typically expect to see in a style guide, you can also document the languages based on the research that you've conducted on your audience group that you need to account for as well. So how do you actually decide which translations your website needs? If possible, you want to talk to your users directly and ask them. But there may also be some laws and policies dictated in your area, either by the state or other organizations. You want to also look for any local programs that provide multilingual content. Those may be a good place to start looking to see what they're doing. And you can also use your web analytics tools. For example, if you have something like Google Analytics or Adobe Analytics installed on your website, you could look at the data in there to see what types of languages users have their browsers set to, and that'll give you a bit of a hint as well. At the end of the day, it's really about understanding your users and conducting a little bit of research so that you know what kinds of user needs there are for the people who are visiting your website and what languages they tend to speak most. We're also going to just go ahead and skip poll 3 for time's sake, but these are some of the most common languages that we've seen the different consumer education sites get translated into as it relates to child care audiences. So there are really 4 options that you have available to you when translating content. for consumer education website, and they have varying degrees of level of effort and kind of costs and resources associated with them, as well as varying degrees of how friendly they are to the users and how easy it makes it accessible to the users. So kind of the ideal way perhaps that a user might experience your consumer education site would be that site's fully translated, meaning that you've worked with people who really have a really high level of understanding, perhaps even native speakers of the language that you're translating to, so that not just the kind of literal translation occurs, but that the exact meaning and tone culturally of your content is preserved in translation. This also prevents what you see sometimes with automated translations, which is the second option, where you see that a literal translation directly performed by a plugin or a tool or a button on the website that does an automatic translation in the browser might often break your site's design. For example, some words in Spanish may be longer, significantly longer than the word that it has been translated to from English, and it may exceed the length of your navigation bar or buttons or other design elements on the site. And so automated translations are certainly an option, and they are, of course, useful, more useful than having no translation available at all to the user, but perhaps they do introduce some challenges that a fully translated site would not have. Of course, you don't have to have somebody actually translating the content, and so the level of effort is a little bit lower. Another thing that you can do is to have print-ready files. So that might look like having a PDF that's available in Spanish or Vietnamese or a language other than the content that the main site content is in. And at least if you're not able to provide a fully translated site or a tool that does an automatic translation, at least someone may be able to download a file that is in the language that they need it in so that they can use it. And finally, another option is to have some human support. So if you don't have the ability to do any sort of translation of the content either through a tool, through an actual translator writing your content for you, or through print-ready files, you can, of course, also give the users a phone number or a text number or some kind of chat option where they can get human support from somebody who does speak the language that they need to interact in. And then, of course, the onus is on the user. They have to leave the site at that point. So it does introduce a little bit of a challenge there, but at least you are providing them with another means of access, which is great. There are many other resources available, and as was mentioned in the chat, the slides will be available, so you can check out these links if you don't have a chance to right now. But digital.gov has a lot of best practices about creating multilingual sites, and of course there are several examples out there in the wild as well that you can check out. Colorado, for example, has a full translation into Spanish for its site, which I'll show an example of in a moment. You can see Georgia has used the automated translation route, and of course Wisconsin has some multilingual content available by connecting via email or phone with staff. So these are different examples of some of the different types that we showed. So you can see, for example, with Colorado Shines, that the content's fully available in Spanish. There's actually a separate Spanish version of the site available at the /es link there in the main URL. And so you can see what happens is the navigation bar and other design elements on the site are designed natively with those Spanish language words in mind so that they all still work. They don't kind of bleed over to new lines or break the site like you might see sometimes with some of the automatic translation options. This is just one example. There are lots of other great examples out there too. Texas, for example, has a lot of content not only available in Spanish but also in Vietnamese for certain target audiences. And with the translation playbook that will soon be available from the State Capacity Building Center, you can see in that there will be some additional resources and links to some of the work that's been done by Texas, Delaware, Maryland, and some of the other states that are doing some great work in this area. And so with that, I will close and hand it back over to Karen to talk about the final poll. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you, everyone, for being on the call today. We do have a couple polls that we want to close with and some additional information. I know we gave you a lot of information today about these different topics, about making your website accessible and translating content on your website. So we'd like you to take a minute and answer this question that's up on the screen about how much did your understanding about this topic improve as a result of this webinar. So we'll give you guys a little bit of time to complete that. And then as you're completing that, I'll also just talk about, as Josh has mentioned, that we do have 2 documents that will be available the early part of next week, and we'll follow up with an email to everyone regarding accessibility, so ideas and tips on how to make your website more accessible. And we also have a document regarding the translation options as well, how best practices in translation. So we'll make sure that you have access to those as well. In the nature of our webinar today around accessibility, we are making sure that those documents are fully remediated and accessible to people who have disabilities. So thank you for taking that poll. And then we will go into the, we can actually just go into the next poll, Violetta. And our next poll asks how likely you are to use these strategies in the future for your work with consumer education websites. If you could take a few seconds or a minute to answer that. And as you're doing that, I would also encourage you to put in some questions in the chat box. We will leave the webinar open for a couple of minutes after 3 o'clock, but we also provided the email to the State Capacity Building Center, where you can email us questions that you might have on this topic, perhaps it's specific to your website, and we will highlight some of those in the Ask Me Anything webinar that we will hold on May 23rd. So our last poll question is, what other webinar topics interest you? We always like to ask this question at the end of our webinars that we host to see if there's any other questions, or I'm sorry, any other webinars that might be of interest to you that we could think about putting on our schedule in the coming months or early part of next year. So if you have any additional webinar topics that are of interest to you, I encourage you to kind of put those in. As we've mentioned here, we do have an Ask Me Anything webinar scheduled exactly 2 weeks today on May 23rd from 2 to 2:30. It's really a question and answer format where we will go through the questions and we'll have our experts provide answers to the questions that you posed around this topic and maybe some concerns that you have with your own website that perhaps we can help work through as well. And then finally, in closing, we want to talk about the next webinar. We have the Ask Me Anything webinar 2 weeks from today, but in June, we'll start a new topic webinar, and this one will be on the National Consumer Education Resources to help states and the preschool development grantees, and that will be on June 13th from 2 to 3 p.m. Again, if you go into the chat pod, the very first link I gave you on the Consumer Ed webinar announcement, you can read more information about that and hopefully sign up and participate to learn about some other national resources that you can use and that could be helpful to the PDG grantees as well. On behalf of all of our speakers in the State Capacity Building Center, we thank you for joining us today, and we look forward for you joining us in future webinars. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.